A worker drops a wrench down a sewer manhole. It's just a completely routine afternoon. The air looks perfectly clear and the space seems entirely benign. They climb down the ladder to retrieve the tool, and bam, they instantly collapse.
Right, just immediately out cold?
Exactly. And then a coworker standing at the top of the hole sees their friend lying there. Without hesitating, they rush down into the dark to help. And seconds later, they collapse too. Welcome to the debate. Today we are unpacking one of the most terrifying phenomena in industrial safety, something known as the chain of death.
It is incredibly grim.
It is, because the first victim in that manhole is exposed to a lethal physical hazard. But the second victim, they are exposed to emotion.
Yeah, it's a devastating reality. I mean, it perfectly illustrates how an everyday, completely mundane task can cascade into a multiple fatality catastrophe in just a matter of seconds.
Exactly. And it forces us to ask a difficult, central question when looking at the material surrounding confined space hazards. When we are confronting invisible killers, things like oxygen deficiency or toxic odorless gases, where should our safety efforts actually be concentrated?
Right, which brings us to our positions today.
Yes. On this show, we explore two distinct perspectives. My position is that eliminating these fatalities requires a relentless, uncompromising focus on engineered controls, continuous technological monitoring, and strict regulatory systems to just completely remove human error. To put it simply, instinct kills, but engineered systems save.
And my perspective is that even the most advanced, robust technological systems will completely fail without a primary focus on human psychology, organizational culture, and managing those deep emotional instincts that drive human behavior in a crisis.
I just don't see how culture stops a gas leak.
Well, you can have all the automated sensors and perfectly written permits in the world, but they mean absolutely nothing when human nature inevitably takes over.
Look, let's start with the physical reality of these spaces, because I believe the fundamental danger is rooted in physics and biology, right? Not just human behavior. Human senses are biologically incapable of detecting hazards like oxygen dropping to a lethal level.
True. We aren't built for it.
Exactly, because we are physically blind to these threats. I argue that safety can only be guaranteed by strict adherence to systemic controls. Things like the OSHA 1926 Subpart AA regulations, continuous atmospheric testing, non-entry rescue equipment. You cannot train away a biological blind spot. You literally have to engineer it out of existence.
Okay. Well, the physics of those hazards are undeniably lethal. I mean, I'm not debating the science there. I come at it from a completely different way. The true root cause of the chain of death isn't a lack of engineering. It's psychological. It's cultural. I mean, over 60% of confined space fatalities are would-be rescuers. Let that sink in.
Wait, 60%? You're saying that well over half the people who die in these environments weren't even supposed to be inside them in the first place?
Exactly. More than half. They are the attendants, the coworkers, the supervisors, who were standing in the fresh air, perfectly safe, and then deliberately chose to enter a lethal environment.
Wow.
Yeah, that staggering statistic proves that paperwork and physical barricades mean nothing when the hero paradox takes over. A perfectly designed regulatory system is entirely useless if, production pressure, severe fatigue, or just a punitive check-the-box mentality has already corrupted the safety culture.
I hear the weight of that statistic, but let's ground this in a specific documented reality. Let's look at the New York FACE Report 03-NY-027. It's a tragic, highly illustrative case of why relying on human judgment is just a fatal error.
The landfill case, right?
Yes, a city engineer entered a landfill manhole, likely just to check a flow meter or grab-drop tool. The oxygen level at the bottom of that manhole was recorded at just 2.1%.
Which is unbelievably low.
Right. So for the listener, let's establish the baseline here. Normal atmospheric oxygen is about 20.9%. Anything below 19.5% is classified as oxygen deficient. When oxygen drops to between 4 and 6%, a human being doesn't just feel a little dizzy, they will fall into a full coma in less than 40 seconds.
Yeah, it's practically instantaneous.
Exactly. So at 2.1%, it is an immediate catastrophic fatality.
And the really terrifying part is that the air looked exactly the same at 2.1% as it did at 20.9%.
Precisely. The engineers saw absolutely no visual warning. There was no smoke, no haze, no alarm bell ringing in their head. This proves to me that relying on human awareness is inherently flawed. Only strict pre-entry systemic testing, like a hard physical rule requiring a calibrated gas monitor to be dropped into that hole before a human head ever crosses the plane, can prevent that first collapse.
I agree entirely on the terrifying physical danger of a 2.1% oxygen environment. The physiological shutdown is absolute. But I want to shift our focus to what happens in the critical seconds after that first collapse, because that is where the fatality count multiplies, and that is where your perfectly engineered systems just fall apart.
How do they fall apart if they prevent the entry?
Because when that engineer goes down, the coworker standing at the top of the hole experiences what psychologists call an amygdala hijack.
Okay, explain the mechanics of that. What exactly is happening in the brain there?
So the amygdala is the emotional, survival-focused center of the human brain, right? It is evolutionarily designed to react milliseconds faster than the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that handles logic, reasoning, risk assessment.
Right, the rational part.
Exactly. So when the coworker looks down and sees their friend dying, they don't run a mental checklist. They don't pause to consider the OSHA regulations or the atmospheric physics you just described. The visual input of a dying friend hits the amygdala. The emotional brain completely overrides the logical brain, and they just rush into the hole unprotected.
Because the logic center is literally bypassed.
Yes, you can't solve that psychological phenomenon with a pre-entry atmospheric test because the worker is bypassing logic entirely.
That's a fascinating biological mechanism, I'll give you that. But let me give you a different perspective on how to handle it. I view that human instinct almost like a deeply embedded computer virus.
A virus?
Yeah. In this specific scenario, we know the human software is programmed with a bug. It's programmed to rush in and rescue a friend regardless of the danger. So if the software is predictably flawed, shouldn't our hardware be the primary focus?
What do you mean by hardware in this context?
I'm talking about physical barriers, bolted hatches, and mandatory non-entry rescue equipment, like a tripod with a winch permanently attached to the worker's harness before they even go in. If the hardware physically restricts a coworker from acting on that flawed instinct, because the first worker can just be winched out without anyone entering, the software bug doesn't matter.
I see where you're going, but
We stalk the chain of death by making entry physically unnecessary and practically impossible without the right engineered equipment.
okay, that's a nice theory. It really is. But have you considered that humans are incredibly adept at bypassing your hardware when they are motivated by panic or, frankly, even just daily production pressure?
But if the tripod is required by the permit,
You can mandate that a non-entry tripod be present all day long. You can write it into every policy. But if the culture of the worksite is rushed and focused entirely on schedule, the crew won't set the tripod up. They'll look at the heavy equipment and say, oh, it's just a quick visual check of a flow meter. We'll be in and out in 10 seconds. We don't need to assemble the winch.
that's a massive violation of the procedure, though.
Of course it is, but it happens every day. And when that unexpected collapse happens, your engineered hardware isn't actually there to catch them. The hardware only exists in reality if the psychological culture on the site actually demands its use.
Well, let's follow that thread, though, because it brings us directly to the nature of the hazards themselves and why I believe technological monitoring absolutely must supersede the human element. You mentioned that people think it will be a quick 10-second check.
Yeah, people underestimate the space all the time.
Right. That assumption is based on the idea that they will naturally notice if something is wrong and just climb back out. Let's look at hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, and nitrogen. These are the classic invisible killers in our industry. Now, H2S is famous for smelling like rotten eggs, right? So workers think, hey, if it smells bad, I'll just leave. But what they don't understand is the biological trap waiting for them.
Oh, you're talking about olfactory fatigue. Yeah, it's a terrifying physiological betrayal.
Exactly. At low levels, you smell it, But when the concentration reaches around 100 to 150 parts per million, H2S actually causes olfactory fatigue, or paralysis of the olfactory nerve. The worker smells the rotten eggs, and then suddenly, the smell completely goes away.
So they think the gas cleared.
Yes. Their flawed biological software tells them, oh, the gas must have cleared out or safe. In reality, the nerve is paralyzed. Minutes later, the concentration might spike to 700 or 1,000 parts per million, which is the lethal knockdown level. They are dead in 2 breaths, and they literally never smelled it coming.
And nitrogen is even more deceptive because it doesn't even offer that initial warning scent.
Right. Nitrogen isn't a typical poison, it's an asphyxiant. It displaces the oxygen in the space. And here is the terrifying truth about the human respiratory drive. The feeling of suffocating, that panicked, choking sensation that makes you gasp for air, is not triggered by a lack of oxygen. It is actually triggered by a buildup of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream.
Which is a huge distinction.
Huge. Because if you are breathing in pure nitrogen, you are still exhaling carbon dioxide normally. Your brain's alarm bell never rings. You don't gasp, you don't feel like you are choking. You just feel a little tired, your vision dims, you pass out, and you die peacefully.
It's silent.
Exactly, because our biology is this profoundly flawed. It mandates technological solutions. We shouldn't even be putting humans in these spaces anymore. We should be utilizing technology like Helios 3 collision-tolerant drones and robotic crawlers to do these inspections. If a robot can drop into the space and check the flow meter, a human shouldn't be anywhere near it.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that technology is the ultimate savior here. I really don't. Let me tell you why. Technology creates a very powerful, very dangerous illusion of control. A sensor or a drone is only as reliable as the human operating it, the human calibrating it, and the organizational system managing the data it provides.
But it's an objective measurement.
Is it? Let's look outside of just confined spaces for a moment to the ultimate example of systemic and technological failure. The 2005 BP Texas City refinery disaster.
Okay, yeah. The explosion during the startup of the isomerization unit that killed, 15 workers and injured 180 others?
Yes. Now, BP had immense amounts of technology. They had sensors, they had automated indicators everywhere. In that unit, they had a 170-foot-tall raffinate splitter tower. During the startup process, they were pumping highly flammable liquid hydrocarbons into this massive tower. There was a level indicator, a technological sensor, transmitting data directly to the control room.
Right, to monitor the fluid levels.
Exactly. But here is the critical failure. That technology was miscalibrated. It was only designed to measure up to 9 feet of liquid in a 170-foot tower. On the day of the disaster, the operators overfilled that tower to 98 feet. That is more than 15 times the normal operating level.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm picturing this correctly. You're saying the operators in the control room were staring at a computer screen, relying entirely on their technology, and the screen told them the tower was practically empty, while it was actually overflowing with explosive liquid?
Exactly. The screen told the operators the liquid was at roughly 8.4 feet and gradually falling. They were flying completely blind while looking directly at a highly advanced piece of technology. Technological systems create a profound false sense of security if the human element, like understanding the physical limitations of your instruments or knowing when a sensor hasn't been properly maintained, is ignored.
That's a powerful example, I agree, but I would frame the root cause differently. Was the BP Texas City disaster genuinely a failure of technology, or was it a catastrophic failure of the systemic rules governing that technology?
Well, they're intrinsically linked.
But if you look at the Chemical Safety Board investigation, they found that BP management completely ignored Amoco's own safety standards regarding outdated equipment. They were venting those highly flammable hydrocarbons directly to the atmosphere through an antiquated 1950s-era blowdown drum, instead of routing it safely to a modern flare system.
That's true. The equipment was wildly outdated.
Right. The technology to handle that overflow safely absolutely existed, but management violated the strict systemic rules that required its use. I see that as a failure of regulatory adherence, not a failure of the engineering concept itself.
But why did they violate those rules? This is the core of my argument. It wasn't because they lacked a policy manual, it was because of organizational culture. Over a period of years leading up to 2005, BP managers faced intense pressure, including a 25% reduction in fixed costs.
Budget cuts always lead to trouble.
Always. And leadership focused heavily on lagging indicators for personal injuries, things like slips, trips, and falls. In fact, they were literally celebrating a record low personal injury rate the very day the plant blew up.
Oh, wow. The irony there is awful.
It really is. They completely ignored process safety indicators. They ignored the fact that the high-level alarm on that very tower had failed to go off repeatedly in the past, and work orders were routinely closed without the actual repairs being done. You can write all the systemic rules, permits, and policies you want, but a check-the-box culture driven by budget cuts will silently dismantle every single one of them.
I see your point, but I'm still not convinced that organizational culture is an insurmountable obstacle, because the entire evolution of modern safety regulations is specifically designed to combat that exact complacency. Look at OSHA 1926 Subpart AA, which is the specific standard for confined spaces in construction.
Okay, let's look at it.
The brilliance of this regulation is that it recognizes how chaotic and dynamic a construction site is, and it demands structural accountability. It doesn't just ask for a piece of paper. It mandates a competent person to specifically identify all hazards before any work begins. It mandates a controlling contractor to coordinate the entire site.
Why is the controlling contractor role so crucial in your view, though?
Because on a dynamic site, you might have one subcontractor doing concrete work and another doing electrical. The controlling contractor ensures that subcontractor A doesn't accidentally pump carbon monoxide from a gas generator into a vault where subcontractor B's team is working. When strict permit-to-work systems are enforced, physically confirming isolation, verifying lockout-tagout, and ensuring continuous positive pressure ventilation, the hazard is neutralized. The permit process forces the safety to happen. It forces a mandatory pause.
I have to strongly disagree with the phrase forces the safety to happen. A permit only records control. It does not create control.
But if it's signed,
A piece of paper on a clipboard does not physically stop a toxic gas leak. Let's go back to the human factors at BP Texas City, because it perfectly illustrates why relying on the permit process is a massive vulnerability. On the morning of that disaster, the board operator managing that overfilling tower was starting his 30th consecutive 12-hour shift.
wait, 30th consecutive shift?
Yes, 30 days straight of 12-hour shifts. He had a calculated cumulative sleep debt of over 43 hours. We know scientifically that severe fatigue drastically clouds decision-making. It causes operators to fixate on a single parameter, like one faulty sensor reading, and completely lose broad situational awareness. How effective is your strict permit-to-work system if the competent person filling it out is practically sleepwalking?
But isn't a strict permit system exactly like a pre-flight checklist for an airline pilot?
How so?
The entire architectural purpose of the checklist is that it does not rely on the pilot being perfectly rested or having a flawless memory or being in a great mood. It forces a mandatory structured pause. It interrupts the very production pressures and fatigue you are warning about. You must physically check the oxygen meter and record the number. You must physically verify the ventilation blower is running. The system is designed to catch the human flaw.
A checklist is utterly useless if the pilot is practically asleep and executive management rewards them for flying blind just to keep flights on schedule.
Come on, that's a bit hyperbolic.
It's really not. If the organizational culture prioritizes speed over safety, that checklist gets pencil whipped. Someone writes 20.9% oxygen on the permit without ever actually turning the atmospheric meter on, because they know if they delay the job to find a calibrated meter, they'll be reprimanded by the site superintendent.
You're saying the system only works if the environment allows it to work?
Exactly. In a punitive culture, near misses are hidden. The BP Safety Culture Survey, which was conducted before the explosion, found that production and budget compliance were rewarded above absolutely everything else. Workers were terrified of a major catastrophe, but they felt totally paralyzed to stop work.
That's a toxic environment.
It is. Preventing the chain of death isn't about perfecting the paperwork. It's about fostering a non-punitive, well-rested culture where a worker feels completely empowered to say, I am not going in that space, I don't care about the schedule, and I'm not signing this permit.
But relying on workers to simply feel empowered is highly subjective. It varies wildly from person to person, from site to site, and even from morning to afternoon, depending on a worker's mood.
It takes strong leadership.
Sure, but the hazards we are discussing today, an atmosphere of 2.1% oxygen, a pocket of methane just waiting for a spark, a silent wave of hydrogen sulfide, they are objective. They are governed by physics. They act in seconds. Therefore, the ultimate defense must be structural. If a space is engineered to require continuous, automated monitoring, and the baseline site rules dictate that a drone does the visual inspection rather than a human, the subjective courage, fear, or fatigue of the worker just becomes irrelevant. We save lives by removing the human from the hazard entirely and strictly managing the perimeter with engineered systems.
And I maintain that no system, no matter how brilliantly engineered, survives an unchecked human element. You can buy the most expensive collision-tolerant drones, you can write the most comprehensive permits, but unless you master the psychology of the amygdala hijack, unless you deeply and repeatedly train workers on exactly why they can't rush in to save their friends, they will bypass your perimeter.
Even with all the barriers.
Yes, they will drop the clipboard, they will ignore the tripod, and they will jump into the hole. Rescue has to be planned in practice before the job even starts. It requires trained personnel, specialized respiratory protection, proper extraction equipment. It is not just two brave workers on a rope. We have to address the human mind, the fatigue of the worker, and the culture of the leadership that sets the tone for the entire site. That is the only way to truly break the chain of death.
Well, it seems we are illuminating this issue from two vital but distinctly different angles. To summarize my position in light of our discussion today, because confined space hazards are physically invisible and biologically lethal within seconds, our primary line of defense must be systemic and technological. We just can't rely on human senses that biologically fail us, like olfactory fatigue, or human instincts that predictably drive us into danger. Strict adherence to engineered controls, continuous atmospheric monitoring, and rigid regulatory frameworks are the only reliable ways to neutralize these threats before they escalate.
And to summarize mine, a perfect regulatory system on paper is completely meaningless in the field if the underlying organizational culture is broken. If workers carry a 43-hour sleep debt, if production pressure encourages pencil-whipping permits, and if we do not actively train against the emotional override of the amygdala hijack, the chain of death will absolutely continue. True safety requires mastering human psychology and fostering an environment where controls are actually respected and understood, not just recorded on a clipboard.
I think where we absolutely converge today is on the fundamental, unforgiving reality of the hazard itself. A confined space does not care about a worker's courage. It doesn't care about their seniority, and it certainly doesn't care about the project deadline.
No, it doesn't negotiate. It responds only to the physics of the atmosphere within it.
Completely agreed. And treating a safety permit as mere paperwork or relying on your nose to act as a calibrated gas detector is a recipe for absolute disaster. These fatalities are rarely caused by one single worker's mistake. They are the final result of weak planning, poor supervision, and a failure of leadership to respect the risk.
It brings us right back to where we started today. A small tool falls into a manhole. A worker climbs down to retrieve it. The air looks perfectly normal. The space seems entirely benign.
But the oxygen level is 2.1%. The worker collapses. The tragedy that follows is not caused by darkness or a lack of visibility. It is caused by invisible killers, weak controls, and a fundamental failure to respect the catastrophic risk of the space.
Exactly. It's a sobering reminder that we have to deeply analyze both the structural engineering of the hazard and the psychological reality of the human being standing at the edge of the hole. There's always more to explore when we start unpacking how industrial systems and human nature collide.
Absolutely. And if you are a safety leader or an industrial project manager trying to build that kind of resilient culture and understand these mechanisms, there is much more to explore. We encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to the Key Safety Talks YouTube channel. We also highly recommend checking out the HSE course linked in the description below. It's specifically designed to help professionals move beyond simple paperwork compliance and build real, effective field control.
Because at the end of the day, when you're staring down into that dark space, you need to know exactly what's waiting for you and exactly how your team is going to react. Join us at Key Safety Talks and learn how to lead safety before the incident, not explain it after the tragedy.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous space isn't always the one that looks threatening. Often, it's the one that looks perfectly safe.